Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of the brain. I'm hoping to fill in some gaps from last night's notes as well as add some to our new ones. So make sure you've got your notes to follow along as we go. All right, so last time we talked about the old brain, or kind of the parts of the brain that other animals might have as well. So then this is the part of the brain that sets us apart from all the other species. It's the higher functioning area of our brain, okay? It is called the cerebral cortex. So let's jump right in. So you might hear these names kind of interchangeably, the cerebral cortex versus this cerebrum or cerebrum. I've heard both. I prefer cerebrum. So the cerebral cortex is the outermost layer of the cerebrum, and it's the most prominent part of the brain, okay, which is the cerebral cortex is made up of your gray matter, and it's going to cover the inside, which is like your white matter. I like to think of the brain as, well, if your brain has these little wrinkles in it called fissures, fissures, F-I-S-S-U-R-E-S. And those fissures allow it to have much more mass, right? So if you consider like a plain sheet of paper has like a certain area, area that it takes up, right? Well, if you crumble it up, you can actually fit more crumbled pieces of paper. And that's kind of how your brain works. If we were to lay it flat, it would cover about 3 feet. 3 feet a square area. But if we crumble it, right, we can fit more in it. So the outer parts are kind of the gray parts, and then the crumbled inner parts are called the cerebrum, or the white parts. We usually just use these interchangeably, so be prepared for that and don't panic if that happens, okay? But the cerebral cortex is responsible for those most sophisticated, or the more sophisticated processing that your brain undergoes. All right, so the lobes of the cerebrum, or the cerebral cortex, are the ones that we're going to be focused on today. So your notes will cover all of these lobes, and we're going to go through, really get into the nitty gritty of each one of these. There are a couple of videos that I posted to our AP classroom, so check those out. There's this one, and I will point them out as we go, but you want to watch these to kind of like solidify some of that information into your brains. All right, so we start with the frontal lobe, also known as the prefrontal cortex. This is the really important part of your brain. This is a part that controls judgment, planning. It helps you to produce speech sounds. It helps you to control your emotions. So you've got your amygdala that gets all riled up. It gets angry and fearful. And then your frontal lobe, or your prefrontal cortex, is what kind of calms that part down and allows you to make rational decisions despite anger or fear or rage or any of those things. It's a big part of our personality. So a lot of our personality is developed in this area. Our temperament, whether you're like a more happy-go-lucky person or a more strict kind of type A person, that's going to be in your frontal lobe. It's also going to control some of your movement. So it works with your motor cortex in order to make precise movements. So I want to, make a sign, right? So I'm using my frontal lobe to tell my motor cortex how to make the signs or the movements. Okay, so really interesting study here. It's a case study of a frontal lobe injury. We kind of may have brushed through him earlier this year, but I want to jump back into him. Phineas Gage, you can see here from the x-rays how this pipe was kind of blown through his head, going through his frontal lobe. So he was a respected, polite, well-liked railroad foreman, and his job was to clear the paths for railroad tracks. So they would do so with dynamite. So one day he was tapping in and working with the dynamite, and it exploded, and the steel rod that he was tapping the dynamite into entered through his skull. So I think it went through his mouth and then out behind his eyeball. And so it permanently damaged his frontal lobe. So if you can imagine the things, so he did survive. He had no speech issues, motor issues, memory impairment, but obviously some severe damage to his frontal lobe. So just based on what we know about the frontal lobe and what it can control, I want you to think about what you think changed about Gage. So take a few seconds and kind of jot down some thoughts, and then, or pause the video, and then I will let you know what I think may have changed with him. Okay, so hopefully you paused the video there. So for Gage, his personality was really changed. And because he was like a foreman and in charge, he really struggled with planning. He struggled with controlling his temper. He would just like fly off the handle all of a sudden. So he lost a lot of his friends. He ended up moving like overseas and then kind of just disappearing after that. So it was a huge effect on Phineas Gage. And if you're like, oh man, I struggle with some of these things like controlling or judgment or planning ahead, that's because your prefrontal cortex or your frontal lobe hasn't fully developed until you're 25 years old. So give yourself a little bit of grace. You'd have like an actual real physical biological excuse for your lack of planning, but your lack of planning is still not my emergency. That's like my favorite sign in my classroom, but there you go. Then we have the motor cortex. So you've got prefrontal lobe. Think about like wearing a headband. That's where your motor cortex is. And this part is so fascinating. It's located again at the back of the frontal lobe, and it's responsible for voluntary movements of your body. So if you can see in this picture here, if you stimulate certain parts of the motor cortex, that body part will actually move. So you can like find YouTube videos of this where people's motor cortex is being stimulated and you see their hands fly up, or they start blinking, just really weird stuff. And they're like completely knocked out while this experiments are going on. Or sometimes they're awake and they're like, why is my hand going up? Or why am I like twitching my nose? That kind of stuff. So really fascinating. The brains are just so fascinated. So the more delicate or precise that movement is, right, then the larger part of your motor cortex will be dedicated to it. Okay, so if you're doing these tiny little movements, right, maybe to do calligraphy or that kind of stuff, that special movement of your hand is going to take more of your brain to do it. So, right, so it's going to be a bigger chunk of your motor cortex. So here you can see this big red part is your fingers. So think about the delicate work that your fingers do, the delicate work that your tongue might do to find the senses, to taste, to swallow. So it's pretty specialized. So it's got a lot, and precise. So it's got a lot of your brain dedicated to it. Homunculus is a way for us to show how much of our brain is dedicated to the body parts, right? So it's a super weird looking figure. So on the left we have sensory model, and on the right we have a motor model. So you can see again, the hands are so big because they take such precise action that they take a big chunk of your brain, right? Your mouth does as well, your eyes, and you can see how like the legs take a way smaller portion than those other pieces. So this is what our body would look like if it was proportionate to the space taken up in our cortex. So super weird, but an interesting little tidbit. Okay, so now we've done the frontal lobe, the motor cortex, and now we're doing the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe is in charge of spatial reasoning, touch, pressure, temperature, pain. Okay, and it includes the somatosensory cortex. Okay, so in this part, we're going to be focusing on this is where your body is going to be regulating those things. So if you feel the pressure of like touching something, or you're feeling pain in some way, this is where your body is processing that. Okay, so here we've got our sensory cortex. So you can see here, this is an FRI image. It's enhanced and it's showing your brain experiencing pain. So the green end indicates sensory pain, so you're feeling it. And the red indicates emotional pain. And you can see that both of those are located in the sensory cortex as well. So it's located at the front of the parietal lobe, largely responsible for perceiving touch and pressure on parts of the body. So if anybody bumps against you in the hallway, your ability to be able to feel that, or touches you, holds your hand, any of that, your ability to feel that is because of your sensory cortex. This is weird too, if part of the sensory cortex is stimulated, you're going to feel that pressure on that corresponding body part. So if you touch in just the right spot, you might feel pressure on your shoulder or your arms or your legs, that kind of thing. So real interesting. And the more sensitive, just like before, the more sensitive that area is, the more surface area of the cortex is going to be dedicated to it, just like the motor cortex beforehand. All right, then we got the temporal lobe. So we're slowly kind of moving back. The temporal is like, I think of it right here, your temples, right behind your ears. So use that to remember because it is where our primary auditory cortex is located. So it does have to do a lot with hearing. It's going to store long-term memories. It's going to store speech and language, and it's going to allow you to understand that speech and language. Oh, real important. Yeah, okay. And then you've got the occipital lobe. So that's in the back, right here, okay? The occipital lobe is going to help you to see. So it's where your primary visual cortex is located. So each piece of this visual cortex corresponds to a particular place on your retina. Just kind of crazy to think about that these eyes see because of this piece way back there. But it's true. And all those little pieces in the occipital lobe that correspond to your eye come together to form the whole picture that you would see. So there it is, occipital lobe right there, right above the cerebrum or the small brain. All right, so association areas. So there are some areas that are not specifically committed to sensory or motor functioning, but they're still involved in higher mental functioning. So let's kind of jump into those. The first one is the Wernicke's area, and this is located in your left temporal lobe. And this one's responsible for language comprehension and expression. So the fact that you can understand the words that are coming out of my mouth right now is because of the Wernicke's area. And if you're able to respond to it by like answering a question or writing down information based on what I'm saying, that's also as a result of the Wernicke's area. Okay, so again, it's in your left temporal lobe. Then you've got Broca's area, and it's in the left frontal lobe, so it's closer here. And it's responsible for directing your motor movement involved with speech. So the fact that I can like move my mouth, create different sounds with my mouth, open and close my jaw, swallow, all those things that lead to speech is because of Broca's area. Okay, so you can see kind of the different locations here of each one. Wernicke's is further back, and then Broca's further back in the temporal, and then Broca's is more forward in the frontal lobe. Okay, so I do want you to kind of put that together. So if we know the Wernicke's is dealing with language and comprehension, and we know that Broca's is just dealing with physical formation and movement of speech, why do their locations make sense? And I want you to think about what maybe the purpose of the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe might be to answer this question. So I will pause to give you a second to jot down. Okay, so if we think back to, actually, we're just going to answer this one in class. So, because I do want you to think it through if you haven't done so already. Okay, so what happens when these areas are damaged, right? Because you can imagine if we have Wernicke's areas damaged, how are we going to comprehend language, or how will we be able to express language? And if we have Broca's area damaged, how are we going to produce language, right? The motor movement for language. So there's a great video on TED Ed about aphasia and how it affects the brain. So check this out. I did load it into Google Classroom today. So jot down a couple things of what happens when these parts are damaged. Okay, the other thing is your hemispheres. So your brain, you actually have two brains, right? They're roughly mirror images of each other. Roughly mirror images. They function as two separate brains normally, except for they've got the corpus callosum. So this corpus callosum actually allows, so this little part here, allows for communication between the both sides of the brain. Okay, so they could function separately, but they function as one because of the corpus callosum straight down the middle. Okay, so the right side of the body, and this is kind of weird to get oriented with, but the right side of the body, so my arm here, is actually being controlled by my left hemisphere of my brain. Okay, which means the left side of my body is being controlled by my right hemisphere. So just kind of remember it as like a crisscross. And they call it lateralization, that crisscross area. Okay, so then we've got your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere. You might have heard things about left brain and right brain, and there is some truth to that, even though it has been a little bit blown out of proportion. But let's talk about some parts that are more specialized to the left side and more specialized to the right side. And hopefully you'll see a pattern as we go through these. So your left side is going to be more your words and letters versus your right side, you're going to be seeing geometric patterns, faces, and emotional expression. Then hearing. So both sides can hear, but your left side's going to do the language of sounds, and then your right side's going to do non-language sounds. So maybe hearing the beeping of a truck or the bird noises or music, right? So non-language, not words. Then you've got your left side. So again, both do memory, but your left side's going to do verbal memory, and then your right side's going to do non-verbal memory. So I think of it like this. If you have like a smell that like brings back, like for me, if I smell grass, I think automatically of like my kindergarten class and my elementary school. And our school was built kind of around a courtyard. So all the doors were always open. And then I could smell the fresh cut grass every morning. So it just brings me back to like that classroom, right? So that is a non-verbal memory, right? Because it's a smell versus a verbal memory would be maybe someone's talking about, my first Halloween costume or something like that. And I can talk about it in that way. Then language. So on the left side, speech, grammar rules, reading, writing, and arithmetic. So if you think about like arithmetic and grammar rules, they follow like patterns, right? So that's all on your left side. Versus your right side, you're going to be able to distinguish the emotional tone of speech. So sometimes people that have autism have issues with this right part, like they don't hear the emotional tone of speech. So if someone's being sarcastic or rude, they're actually just understanding the speech from their left brain, but their right brain isn't interpreting that emotional tone. So they have to be taught how to interpret that tone as like positive or negative, or else they may not understand that they're being made fun of or that it's being said in jest. They just do not know. Okay, spatial abilities is also going to be on your right side. So geometry, your sense of direction. So I feel like my right side needs to develop more as far as this because I'm always getting lost, but distance, even the rotating of shapes, being able to mentally picture, okay, I'm going to go up the stairs and then to the right to go to my daughter's room or whatever it is, that's going to be on your right side. So if you're kind of maybe noticing a pattern here, or try to create one in your mind if you can. So on the right side, it's way more like emotionally based, right? Versus the left side, it's way more, it's kind of just like by the book, rule based. Okay, so that's kind of the difference here. And like I said, it does get blown out of proportion. Like, oh, I'm a left brain, I'm a right brain. We're actually both brains together, but there are like more specialized things on each side. So you can imagine if there's damage on one side, or if we are under a condition that maybe doesn't develop one side as much as it can, then we can suffer some of the ramifications of that. Maybe losing, again, like I was talking about, the emotional tone of speech, or not being able to read geometric patterns. We have things called like facial blindness. Actually, Brad Pitt is known for being suffering from facial blindness, meaning that he might meet the same person over and over again and not recognize their face. So that's a real like medical condition, dependent on that for him is an effect of his brain, or how his brain is developed. Brain plasticity. So this is a huge concept. And actually, I really like this picture to show you the difference between the cerebral cortex and the cerebrum. So the cerebral cortex would be the brown parts all around, and the cerebrum would be that white part on the inside. So I think of it as like the filler or the marshmallowy part of the brain. It's kind of gross to think about, but there it is. Okay, so brain plasticity could also be known as neuroplasticity. And it is all about the fact that the brain is able to continuously change through one's life. So there's not this idea of like, oh, if you don't use it, you're going to lose it. That is actually not true. In fact, when our brain has damage to it, sometimes it can rebuild those connections that were lost through whatever, an accident, that kind of thing. So your brain activity, again, is associated with certain functions, and it can be transferred to a different location. So let's say you are like, okay, so that autistic example I was saying earlier, maybe they're not able to read it like automatically, the emotion in the speech. Well, they can train their brain in a different area to translate that information for them. So just because that information isn't immediately happening in their brain doesn't mean that we can't teach our brain to develop that information or to add it later on. Okay, so that's really important. It's a huge concept in brain plasticity. Okay, so then we've got something called the split brain procedure. And obviously, we wouldn't want to just split someone's brain just to kind of see what would happen, right? But it does help us to understand the lateralization of the brain. So we can look at case studies of people who have had to have this. And usually they have to have it due to a medical condition, right? So it is known that actually cutting through the corpus callosum allows seizures to, sometimes it will cause seizures to stop. And so some patients do opt for something like this, okay? So we do get a lot of our information about even the fact that our brain is kind of like split this way, right? So this part controls, the right controls the left side, the left controls the right side. We know this because of the information that we've been able to gain from these split brain patients. So again, if you think about split, we do split right down the middle in the corpus callosum. So you can see it here where that would be cut. Okay, so the surgery again allows it to be split from each other, and it's gonna bring down the cases of epilepsy. So it does work, it is important, and it is an option, even though it can seem extreme sometimes. Obviously, there are gonna be side effects, right? So seeing these side effects allows us to see how each part of the brain is specialized in a different way. So that's how we're able to explain this slide, right? So how do we know all this? Actually from split brain patients. So really important information. There's another video that I've loaded onto Google Classroom about the split brain, so you can kind of see which side does what, and you'll see an experiment as well. And there's a second video about a person living with a split brain. All fascinating, and we'll try to do a split brain activity in class so you can kind of see in real life what it would feel like to only be able to use one side of your brain and for the two brains not to communicate in the way that we're so used to them doing right now. All right, so really it's about knowing what each other brain can do and can't do, particularly with language and speech, and as well as knowing that the hemispheres control, right? So the left hemisphere, right hemisphere, left and right, they control opposite sides of the body. So let's pretend we have Sally, and she is a split brain patient, and she's seeing a baseball in her right visual field, right? Seeing a baseball. So where does that go in her brain? I'm gonna pause for a second. All right, so I hope you said the left hemisphere, right? Because it's going to be that split lateralization. Can she say that she sees a baseball? I'm gonna pause right there and give you a second. All right, yes, because the left side is where language is located, right? So she can say that she's seeing this baseball. If she holds a baseball in her left hand, I actually have one, so random. Okay, she holds a baseball in her left hand. Can she say she's holding a baseball? Okay, so even though the right brain received this info, right, like it's seeing it, right brain to the left, it actually does not have the ability to speak. So she couldn't say it. Does that make sense? Okay, if you were confused in that or it didn't quite make any sense, go back and look at the specialized parts or how the brain has been, the two hemispheres have specialized abilities, and then how that crossover actually will be able to affect the person with the split brain. And again, watch those two videos. One of them is about a patient living with split brain, and one of them is just an example to kind of review what the split brain lateralization looks like. Okay, that's all I've got for you guys today. Make sure to fill out the Google form attached underneath this video and let me know what questions you have. We're gonna have a brain test on Monday. So that would be September, oh gosh. So this was September 23rd. So be ready for some split brain questions. And then my plan is to do an endocrine nervous system quiz this Friday, okay? I know this is a lot of biology. It is not my forte, meaning like I know what I need to know for psychology, but it's not my favorite. I do think it's really fascinating when we get into it. So just give yourself some time to digest this information if you're kind of like me, where you like more of the social aspects and of psychology, not necessarily these like sciencey bits. We are almost out of the sciencey, like really like in-depth parts. So hang in there. We can do this together. All right, guys, I will see you soon.